Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise at a time of widespread and acute peril for the national security of the United States and for America's allies. Led by China, our enemies and our adversaries, Russia, Iran, North Korea, are actively cooperating to target us and our allies all over the world. In extreme cases, Mr. President, they seek nothing less than the physical annihilation of the countries they're targeting. In Europe, Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In Asia, China is engaged in day-by-day aggression against our allies and is threatening another full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And in the Middle East, Israel is fighting for its survival in the face of a war of extermination being waged against it by the Iranian regime. October 7th was the worst one-day mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Iran and its terrorists have attacked Israel from the Gaza Strip, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Judea and Samaria, from Yemen, from Iraq, and from Iran. And what has the Biden administration's policy been, Mr. President? Since the opening days of this administration, they have pursued an obscene policy of denying weapons to our allies while allowing resources to flow to our enemies. They immediately halted arms to our Arab allies that they were using against Iran's Houthi terrorists while lifting sanctions simultaneously on the Houthi terrorists. The Houthis immediately launched a vast offensive and today are significantly blocking shipping through the Red Sea. The administration denied critical weapons such as ATACMS to Ukraine at a period that they could have stalled Russia's offensive, providing both time and space for Iran to flood drones to be used by Russian forces against Ukraine. And of course, the Biden administration flooded unaccountable hundreds of millions of dollars into the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, which they knew would benefit Hamas. Joe Biden sent that money to Gaza even though he was warned that the money would inevitably go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. I joined 19 senators in making that point explicitly. If you send this money to Gaza, it will be used by Hamas for terrorism, and we now know that the Biden administration agreed with me. The Biden administration concluded that it was, quote, highly likely, that is their assessment, highly likely, that the money going to Gaza would be used by Hamas for terrorism. Now, ordinarily, under U.S. anti-terrorism law, that's the end of the matter. If it's highly likely the money will be used for terrorism, you don't send it. You know what they did instead? They waived our anti-terrorism law and said, send it anyway. I guess they're okay if Hamas uses U.S. dollars to murder Israelis, because that's exactly what happened. After October 7th, the administration didn't change. Even after October 7th, the Biden administration has slowed and halted critical weapons that our Israeli allies need to counter Hamas. That utter incoherence has entangled this body. During the debate over the last national security supplemental, I and many other lawmakers found ourselves unable to support the policy, in part because we did not believe that the Biden administration would faithfully implement the authorities and appropriations Congress would be providing. Mr. President, those doubts were subsequently publicly confirmed. President Biden has explicitly said that he is blocking precision weapons to Israel, and that he would even block artillery if Israel moves to fully root out Hamas from Rafah. I'll add, Mr. President, that this policy is particularly egregious in the context of the Gaza Pier, because the Biden administration requires Israelis to provide force protection for the pier while denying them the weapons they need to do so. Senate Democrats have unfortunately found themselves in the position of knowing that this policy is both incoherent and catastrophic, but at the same time, it's their party's policy, so they defend it anyway. What we should be doing is providing Israel weapons now and denying Hamas the resources it needs to continue its war of terror against Israel. That's why in a moment, I'm going to propound a unanimous consent request to ensure that the Biden administration delivers to Israel the weapons that the Biden administration is withholding. This legislation's already passed the House. In a moment, it might pass the Senate. For folks at home who are watching, you should watch very carefully. When I raise the unanimous consent request, a Democrat senator will stand up and begin speaking. He will begin by saying, reserving the right to object, and then he will give some remarks. Listen for 2 words. I object. Because this is binary. If at the end of his remarks, he says, I object, it will defeat this motion, and it will mean that Senate Democrats have decided they agree with Joe Biden in blocking weapons to Israel. And if he doesn't, if he gives the identical speech and just pulls out his pen and crosses out those 2 words written at the bottom of the speech, he just doesn't say, I object, you know what happens? The legislation that has already passed the House would pass the Senate unanimously, 100-0, and go to the president's desk for signature. Just about every member of this body goes and gives speeches and says, I support Israel. Well, talk's cheap. If you support Israel, provide them the weapons they need in a time of war. We're going to find out if the Democrats are willing to do so or not. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 398, H.R. 8369. I further ask that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
reserving the right to object. The war in Gaza has been a humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and wounded. Thousands of children are not able to obtain medical care that they urgently need. Hundreds of thousands of people in northern Gaza have been told to relocate again and again and again. There's no safe place for these innocent people to go in Gaza. Also, 100 precious lives of hostages do remain in Hamas control, and I am very upset about the escalation of anti-Israel sentiment here in our own country. But as everyone is painfully aware, that Hamas built its underground system of tunnels and military command beneath Gaza's schools, hospitals, and other civilian structures. Very difficult dilemma, but the answer is not the entire destruction of Gaza. And Secretary of Defense Austin said there's a better way to prosecute the military campaign than to eliminate Hamas while protecting civilians. That's our military leader. And that's a sentiment that's shared by many U.S. military officers, both active and retired, and incidentally, many Israeli officers. Israel has received, as my colleague from Texas knows, and as my colleague from Texas also knows, Israel has continued to receive massive amounts of U.S. weapons, ammunition, and other military aid. And the Congress passed an emergency supplemental. in addition to the fiscal year 2024 appropriations bill. And together they provide literally billions of dollars in military aid for Israel. So the suggestion, Mr. President, that Israel is lacking for U.S. weapons and ammunition is without any merit whatsoever. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians will not be solved with more bombs, particularly when the Netanyahu government has yet to articulate achievable goals or a credible plan for what comes next after the war ends. Something, Mr. President, that many Israeli citizens are pointing out and objecting to the manner in which Prime Minister Netanyahu is conducting this war. And in the meantime, starvation is escalating for women and children, innocent people in Gaza, who had nothing to do with what happened on October 7th. And incidentally, as the senator from Texas knows, every single one of us in the Senate is absolutely horrified by what Hamas did on that day, October 7th. And as my good friend from Texas said, that was the worst mass murder of innocent Jewish people since the Holocaust. Horrifying. I think it's fair to say that everybody in this body wants the war to end. They want a secure, peaceful Israel, and we want a secure, peaceful Palestinian state. But the suggestion that the U.S. government is not providing significant aid to Israel, which I've objected to, but this Congress has supported by a very large margin, is flat out wrong. So for these reasons, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I move to discharge S.J. Res. 89 from the Foreign Relations Committee.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, moves to discharge S.J. Res. 89, a joint resolution to direct the termination of the use of United States Armed Forces and so forth from the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, the Gaza Pier is a perfect example of the Biden administration's foreign policy incoherence. This was a nearly $500 million stunt trying to buy a few votes in Michigan. It's been an unconscionable waste of American taxpayer dollars. And simultaneously, it has undermined America's geopolitical credibility with our allies. The pier is unnecessary. We can debate whether sufficient aid is getting to the Gaza Strip. But I believe that our Israeli allies have taken unprecedented steps to ensure that indeed there is. I understand that many Democrats disagree. What is undeniable, however, is that whatever aid is coming in, it has not, will not, and indeed could not have come through this godforsaken pier. The operation was simply too insignificant and too convoluted. Moreover, we know that Hamas diverts aid delivered through this pier. The pier has also been reportedly attacked by Palestinian terrorists, and 3 U.S. service members have been injured because of pier operations. Further, the pier has cost American taxpayers a minimum of $320 million to construct. And that was an estimate from April, so it is surely higher now. Meanwhile, we have required our Israeli allies to provide a, quote, security bubble around the pier. We are pressuring them to protect this operation, which is bringing supplies hijacked by Hamas. And Mr. President, Joe Biden is asking Israel to protect the Gaza Pier from Hamas while denying Israel the weapons to counter Hamas. And as we just saw, Senate Democrats are endorsing that policy. I find it difficult, Mr. President, to think of a more ridiculous policy. Let's be clear. American policy should be unequivocal. We need to ensure that Israel has the military and diplomatic support to utterly eradicate Hamas. That's good for Israel and it's good for America. Unfortunately, we've seen a recurring theme from the Biden administration and from Senate Democrats. Undermine Israel at every step of the way and aid terrorists at every step of the way. In fact, this administration has been the greatest friend to Hamas and Hezbollah and the greatest ally to the Ayatollah Khamenei on the entire planet. Under the Biden presidency, over $100 billion has flowed to Iran. $6 billion of it was in ransom for 5 Americans, a policy which I warned at the time would lead to more Americans taken hostage. Tragically, on October 7th, we saw that come to pass. Where we are now is the Biden administration is sending money to Gaza, and they're combining it with blocking weapons to Israel. The policy is utterly backwards. If you ask anyone on the street, what should we do on foreign policy, they would say we should support our friends and stand up to our enemies. Unfortunately, Joe Biden and the Democrats, their policy is block weapons to our friends, block weapons to Israel, and send billions of dollars to our enemies who are actively trying to kill Israelis and actively trying to kill Americans. It is Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. Now, what the Senate should be doing is voting on the legislation the House has already passed to provide the weapons Israel needs now. Just a minute ago, I tried to pass that here on the floor of the Senate, and you saw Senate Democrats object to that. Why is it that we're not voting right now on providing weapons to Israel that Joe Biden has blocked? Because Senate Democrats do not want to vote on it. The only reason it didn't pass a minute ago is that a Senate Democrat objected and did so on behalf of all of the Democrats, and we know that it is all of the Democrats. Because Chuck Schumer is the majority leader of this body, Senator Schumer could schedule the House bill for a vote anytime he wants, and he said he will not allow it to come to a vote. So understand, if you support Israel, the reason the Biden administration is able to block weapons from going to Israel is because every Senate Democrat is standing in solidarity with this White House, blocking weapons from going to Israel in a time of war. The reason you heard the words, "I object," is some Senate Democrats don't want to go on the record for that. They don't want to actually cast the vote. The senator who objected is from the state of Vermont. Vermont is a bright blue state, a state that they comfortably believe is safe to make an objection. Senators who are on the ballot in red or more purple states are not eager to go on record on this question. Procedurally, I do not have the ability to force a vote on passing the already passed House bill that would provide immediate weapons to Israel. There's not a procedural vehicle to do that, but there is a procedural vehicle to vote on the mirror image of that policy. If we can't vote saying America should provide weapons to our friend, the state of Israel, what we can vote on is we should stop giving money to our enemies, to Hamas. The Gaza Pier is flowing money to Gaza that is benefiting Hamas. And under the War Powers Act, I have the ability procedurally to force a vote, which we're about to have, on whether to cut off that money. Everyone at home, I want you to understand, this is a vote, yes, on the Gaza Pier, yes, on cutting off money to Hamas, but it's also a vote on the other half of the policy, should we provide weapons to Israel? I would have more than happily withdrawn this War Powers resolution if the Democrat majority would allow a vote on the legislation that's already passed the House providing immediate weapons to Israel. But Democrat leadership doesn't want that vote. So I'm going to force the only vote we can get. And understand, when you see Democrat after Democrat after Democrat walk down to the well of the Senate and vote, and I'm going to make a prediction, they're going to vote quietly. You may see a couple who have been among the loudest opponents of Israel. A couple may vote loudly. But most Democrats are going to walk in very quietly and go to the clerk and go, no. Maybe point down quietly, but it's not going to be a vote they're proud of. It's going to be a vote that they hope their constituents don't know about. They hope that the men and women they represent don't hear about. And it's going to be a vote, sadly, that simply reflects party loyalty, that the Biden White House has cracked the whip and said, we support our enemies, we oppose our friends, now fall in line and vote accordingly. I'm hoping that Senate Democrats will rediscover that the Senate is an independent body, that the Senate doesn't work for the White House, even if your own party is in charge, that the Senate was designed to provide checks and balances on the president, especially concerning foreign policy, that the Senate is given by the framers of our Constitution unique responsibilities concerning foreign policy. The responsibility to declare war, the responsibility to ratify treaties, the responsibility to confirm ambassadors, to confirm the Secretary of State, to confirm military officers. The framers designed the Senate to check an executive, whether from your own party or the opposing party. There was a long history of Senate Democrats who were willing to stand up to Democrat presidents. You know, there was a Senate Democrat named Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson actually had the courage to stand up, even if it was a Democrat president, and fight for American national security. I wish we had even one Scoop Jackson Democrat left in the Senate. Even one Democrat who would stand up and say, look, I'm with the Biden White House most of the time. But on cutting off weapons to Israel, on funding Gaza, on sending money to Iran and Hamas, enough is enough, I can't do that. It's within the prerogative of every senator to do just that. And I would note it's possible. You know, we just had a Senate Judiciary markup. Where going into the markup, everyone assumed that a judicial nominee from New York was going to be voted favorably out of the Judiciary Committee. Now, this was a particularly radical nominee. This is a nominee who, as a magistrate judge, had ordered a 6'2" biological man who is a serial repeat rapist to be housed at a women's prison, putting every woman in that prison at risk of sexual assault or rape. It's an extreme and radical nominee. I and others led the opposition to it. I will tell you, we just had the markup. We walked into the markup, and everyone assumed, as has happened for 3.5 years, that the Democrats would vote like the Politburo, and vote for whatever extreme nominee was in front of us, and something shocking happened. When the vote happened, one of the Democrat senators, Democrat senator from Georgia, voted no. The nominee was defeated. I'm going to point to that as an example to the Democrats in this chamber. I understand the White House expects you to fall in line, that President Biden is coming to join you for lunch today. But every senator has the prerogative to make your own choice. Do you agree with undermining Israel? Do you agree with flowing money to Gaza and Hamas and Iran and terrorists who want to kill us? And if you don't, the people of your state have elected you and given you the prerogative and given you the voice to stand up and say no to this policy that is endangering America and endangering our allies. I urge every member, Republican and Democrat, to stand together united. It would be powerful if we saw a bipartisan vote saying We stand with our friends and we stand against our enemies, and enough with this nonsense of funding people who want to kill us. Mr. President, I yield the floor.